going into round 5 in Shamkir. Wesley So was leading. Let's see how he got on today. He faced Vachier-Lagrave and Anand. It's a real clash of the generations. Anand with the white pieces. Anand has played, it's a Spanish, and he's played a kind of anti-martial system. He's making sure that d5 is not going to happen here. You know, he's constructed a modest but solid pawn chain. It's almost a symmetrical position. Wesley has had exactly this position a couple of months ago in Vachier-Lagrave. He played Caruana, and he also played knight b8, and there Caruana played a4. The game, it's an interesting game, finally ended in a draw. What's the point of knight b8? Well, the knight doesn't stand brilliantly on c6, blocks the c-pawn. Sometimes you can use this, and sometimes the knight will come back to this, should be a superior square on d7. It's a very standard move if you, in the Spanish, if you think of the Brea variation, for example. Now, instead of a4 as Caruana played, Anand played this extraordinary move, knight g5. This looks like school's chess to me. I mean, well, what's first of all, you have to ask yourself, what is the idea if black simply pushes this knight? I don't think taking it on f7 is very good. I think black is just fine there, 2 minor pieces for the rook. I guess Anand would just come back and then try to prove that this pawn on h6 is a slight weakness. In certain circumstances, it might be possible to throw that knight into g6, exploiting that pin, or perhaps come to f5. But that knight is rather loose on h4, you have to be rather careful. But I guess that's the idea. But Wesley did not play h6. He played knight c6. I mean, this looks really paradoxical to bring the knight back to this square again. But there is logic behind the move. Once the knight has gone from f3, then this knight heads for the beautiful d4 square. Anand preempted that and withdrew the bishop, knight d4. And Anand didn't want to live with that knight, so he played knight e2. And this was exchanged off. h6 from Wesley, putting the question to the knight. Anand isn't going to take on f7, so one might anticipate knight f3. But after those exchanges, it certainly doesn't look as dangerous for black. Anand met h6 with this most extraordinary move, f4. Incredible. Wesley, after 31 minutes, took the knight. It's still not entirely clear to me how Anand was going to follow up if this was simply played. I still don't think he would take on f7, that doesn't look right to me. Perhaps he was just going to come back to f3. And then we have what looks like a very typical King's Gambit position. White could try to blast open those pawns immediately, or you could perhaps play bishop d2 and wait your turn, and sometimes play a knight into d4. I mean, sometimes go for e5. Well, it would have been interesting to see how Anand played that position. But anyway, Wesley didn't take on f4, he took on g5. And this is extremely dangerous. So the knight's attacked, moved to g4, now g6. Be careful, watch that pin. Once more we see the power of this Spanish bishop raking across the board. And let me show you just how dangerous this is. Suppose black blocks the attack on f7. Then white wins immediately with rook takes and queen h5. And black can't defend satisfactorily against all the threats. So Wesley played bishop g5. Bishop takes f7 isn't too good here. That can just be taken, and actually black's king's all right there. But Anand played h3. And an exchange, and then went back to h6. Once again, knight f6 would be a mistake, and that is fatal. So knight h6 and queen h5. White still a piece down. Bishop e6, so blunting the bishop. But now, incredibly, although it seems as though black has survived the first wave of attack, in fact, after this very mechanical, slow motion attack, white wins back the piece. There's no defence to this. And this is how the game went. c6, an exchange on f8, the rook came over, and g5. The knight has no squares, no decent squares. Wesley sought salvation in a queen endgame, but you can see in this position that pawn on g6 is absolutely massive, particularly after white got the pawn to h5. It's now a protected pass pawn, and you won't be surprised to learn that Vichy's technique was quite good enough to win this game. It went on for another 15 or so moves, but a convincing victory for Anand. I mean, it's fantastic to see Vichy playing this way. You know, this harks back to his early days, you know, 25 years ago, when he was first on the scene, and he used to play these kind of risky attacks. Great to see. So Anand in great form in this tournament, and Wesley takes a hit there. Let's turn to Carlsen against Vachier-Lagrave. Well, in this game, Magnus got a positional advantage, very nice advantage out of the opening, and Maxime has been struggling, and here you can see black's pawn structure is dreadful. You could play passively here, but I don't hold out much hope for black. White's pieces are so well placed, and these pawns and black's pieces are really ugly. So Maxime played more actively with a4, but it's a bit desperate, to be honest. Carlsen took the pawn on d6, and this is Maxime's idea. So he's trying to target that pawn on a2, but watch Carlsen's technique. This is really nice. First of all, he makes sure that this knight isn't going to go anywhere. Of course, that knight would love to take a trip around c3, but let's squash that idea. But now the rook comes down. Okay, pay attention. Bishop c6, good move. And this really restricts the knight. So, for example, well, rook d7 check is threatened. If the knight tries to run out to a6, then bishop d5. If the knight goes back to c7, then bishop c4 totally dominates that knight. It's in huge trouble. Or knight c5, and that pin is very, very annoying. So Vachier-Lagrave played rook takes a2, allowing the knight on c7 to be taken. But suddenly it's a little bit problematic. In fact, this is a kind of last desperate try. If white's a little bit careless, I mean, king g4 is still probably good, but it gets a bit more problematic after rook c1, threatening a2, a1. But Magnus had it under control. Very quickly he took on h7. Good move. So rook takes bishop obviously loses to rook takes pawn check. If a2, the rook goes behind, and that's a very simple winning rook and pawn endgame. So king g6, and the rook bounced back to c7, protecting the bishop. King f6. Black really can't do anything here. Again, pushing the pawn wouldn't achieve anything. h5. This is very clever. This closes the box around the king. If, for example, rook c5, then let's just hem the king in, and now there's no defense to rook f7. Oh, no satisfactory defense to rook f7 and mate. Rook c1 played. So now there is, well, potentially a threat to play a2, but Magnus has it under control. He switched back here. This is a great idea. So again, rook takes bishop loses. And on a2, as happened in the game, bishop d5 is now winning. Let's give black the queen, but he loses his king, and that's checkmate. Very nice technique from Magnus. Very curiously, in Shahriar Mamedyarov against Vladimir Kramnik, there was another excellent example of the power of rook and bishop dominating a rook and knight. Let's just zip through this one very quickly. It's fantastic to see. I'm a big fan of rook and bishop in endgames, and we see this very well here. So you can see there's a horrible pin, but pawns are equal. They're all on one side of the board. You'd think that black has decent drawing chances. Let's see, Kramnik stepped out of the pin. And now Mamedyarov didn't panic. He just improved the position of his king a little bit. And king g2. All very nice. If black were to wait passively here, watch what happens. Now we can see how we can use the king really nicely. So black waits passively. Now, having improved the position of the king, white can transpose into a winning king and pawn endgame. g4, tempo move, the king has to go back. We come in and we have one more tempo move, the pawn on f3, and that's a win. So for example here, and the pawns drop. So Kramnik has to move the knight, he can't wait passively. And now again a very nice moment. I mean, rook and bishop look fantastic here. King trapped on the back rank. Check. Can't go to f8 because the f pawn will drop. So the king is pushed to a worse square. Now rook h7 is possible, going after the h pawn, but well, you have to deal with this bit of counterplay. Threats here and maybe knight d3. So Mamedyarov makes sure that everything is perfect before he plunges in. So this pushes the knight to a worse square. So Kramnik had to play knight e6. Okay, now we move the rook back. And again, push the king to a bad square before we go to h8. That means that black has to be very careful about checks here, for example. So knight c5. You could take here again, but once more there is counterplay. So a check. Okay, black has to interpose with the knight, otherwise the rook drops. And in this case, I'm afraid the king and pawn endgame would be a draw. Let's just check that one. Here and f5. The king is shut out just in time. So Mamedyarov waits. King f3. Now black has to get out of the pin because white's king is coming forward. But the king is knocked back again. And now bishop f5. Now there is a clear threat again. If rook d4, for example, if black waits, then once again white can go for this king and pawn endgame, and the king is in a good position or winning position. So there's no real defense here. The rook could switch defense to this side, push the king back and defend like this. But in this case, I think finally white would go for the h-pawn, and the rook is just in a really poor position. There's no counterplay against the king. Kramnik played e4. Well, he's trying to confuse things. But instead of taking immediately, this is really nice. Mamedyarov held the position for a moment and only then took on e4. And, well, now it's a clear pawn. But importantly, black's pieces are still really poorly placed. You can see how the king can't defend the pawns. That knight is totally dominated by the bishop. And yeah, the rook cuts the king, and well, Mamedyarov succeeded in winning that one very, very easily. The h-pawn finally dropped. Beautiful technique, and another fine example of how powerful rook and bishop are against rook and knight. After 5 rounds, Magnus Carlsen is in the lead with 4. Wesley So has 3.5. Anand has 3. Kramnik and Mamedyarov 2.5. Tomorrow, Wednesday, is a free day in Shamkir. They play round 6 on Thursday, and I'm looking forward to the game between Anish Giri and Magnus Carlsen. Remember, Giri has a plus score against Carlsen.